There were hundreds of thousands of young men who enlisted into the war from every country. None of them knew how much worse war was than they imagined. Some men who didn't want to go to war were peer pressured into doing so by their friends. Some groups of friends wanted to be in the same company together. They could all enlist to be in the same company back then. This was called Pals Battalions. In this scene, the teenager was being encouraged by his father to enlist. His father is proud of that his son is fighting for his country. The mother, on the other hand, is upset because she didn't want to take the risk of losing her son forever. This was often the case with parents. The father was so proud, and the mother was being worried of losing her son.
Men were so excited to sign up that they crowded the enlisting places. They all thought they were going to be heroes. They were convinced because of earlier wars that didn't pose much of a threat to your life. All they had heard about in their lifetime was wars where people came back heroes. Men went into this enlistment thinking that the war would be a chance for them to get a name for themselves. They didn't expect the war to be so intense and dramatic. Everybody wants to be a hero, but in the reality, most of them won't be. Most of them will die on the battlefield. In this picture, we show men flowing in and out of the building. They are lining up, trying to enlist in the army. They are all very excited. This picture will look very similar to a photograph taken in 1914 on Enlistment Day in most countries.
The men who enlisted were put into basic training for about 2 weeks or however long their company needed to be ready for the front line. In this time, they would learn how to march together and how to shoot. Previous wars haven't been very tough. The training wasn't as preparing as it should have been. In this picture, we show the men being trained to march and to shoot. We thought this was significant because this seems like so little training to go into combat.
The general battlefield consisted of no man's land in the middle. This was an area where there was barbed wire strung across to slow down the enemy on an attack. Then on each side they had their trenches. There were 3 rows of trenches. The first row was called the front line. This is where men lined up all the way across, just waiting for someone to run out into no man's land. There were men with rifles and men with machine gun turrets across the front line. The second row is support. This is where there would be men that would basically there for support. The third row is where there were the big artillery guns that fired the human-sized bullets in the enemy's trenches and in no man's land when the enemy was charging. In this picture, we show an outline of what the trenches would look like from above. We show on each side, one side charging. We also show explosions from the human-sized bullets. This is what a battlefield might look like during combat. No man's land was basically where no man went. Barbed wire was strung across the entire 250 yards. No man's land was under constant shelling and machine gun fire. It was practical suicide to be in this stretch of land.
The men stayed in dugouts when they were not out fighting. They would have a lot of downtime. With so much downtime, it became hard on them mentally. This is when some soldiers went insane. The dugouts were very small and there was not much to do. They played cards and slept. One problem that became very troublesome was all the rats getting into the dugouts. They were constantly killing rats. These rats were eating the little food that the soldiers were given. They were scared of them since they would crawl on their faces while they slept at night. In this picture, we show mice on the ground. We show the men sleeping, playing cards. They will do anything they can do to pass the time, especially during the bombing. If they leave, they could be killed. When there is a bombing, all you can do is wait and pray you don't get hit by the next bomb dropped. Sometimes soldiers will experience something called shell shock. Shell shock is when a soldier will go crazy because of bombs going off everywhere. Men have to spend long periods of time in these dugouts. It was very hard to keep sane.
Many men were wounded throughout this brutal war. Friends often visited their wounded friends. When their friends were in this wounded and depressed state, people would often lie to them, saying everything would be all right, even if they were destined to die. The lying was not uncommon. People would lie to protect the other from a bad psychological state. Sometimes they would lie to themselves as well. In this picture, there is a wounded soldier with all his friends crowded around him. They are telling him that everything is going to be okay, even if things weren't going to be all right. This is an example of what went on with a lot of people.
When soldiers return home on leave and they talk to people in the public, they would get frustrated. The reason why they would get frustrated is because often the people in their hometown don't know the whole story on war. This is a generality to most soldiers. In this picture, the soldier is returning home and people are trying to tell him how the war is. He doesn't like this because he knows what is really going on and no one understands him.
As some soldiers were given leave, it was very hard for them back at home. Everyone thought they knew what they were going through, but really, no one understood. Often they would return from leave early since they could not handle the normal world. After the war ended, many soldiers re-enlisted and came back since they were the only people who understood what they were going through. In this picture, the soldier wasn't understood on leave when he went home. He felt so out of place that he wanted to return early to the place that is so awful. He does this because this is the only place where he's understood.